In the dusty basement of the Whitmore Estate auction house, appraiser Sarah Chen lifted a heavy wooden frame from beneath a moth-eaten cloth. The photograph inside, sepia-toned and cracked with age, showed what appeared to be a typical Edwardian family portrait taken in an elaborate garden. But as Sarah adjusted her magnifying glass to examine the image more closely, something made her pause, something that would lead her down a path she never could have imagined. The photograph depicted the Ashford family of Yorkshire, England, captured in their prized rose garden during the summer of 1906. Lord Edmund Ashford stood proudly behind his wife, Lady Margaret, while their 3 daughters arranged themselves in descending order by age. 15-year-old Victoria sat primly in a white dress, 13-year-old Catherine posed with a book in her lap, and 11-year-old Isabel knelt beside the garden fountain, her dark hair adorned with an intricate silk ribbon. Sarah had been appraising estate photographs for nearly 2 decades, but something about this particular image troubled her. She couldn't quite place what it was until she noticed the ribbon in young Isabel's hair. Unlike the simple bows worn by her sisters, this ribbon appeared to be tied in an unusually complex pattern, almost like a series of knots rather than a decorative bow. The auction catalogue listed the photograph simply as Family Portrait, Ashford Estate, 1906, photographer unknown. But Sarah's trained eye caught details that others might miss. The composition was slightly off-center, as if the photographer had been in a hurry. The shadows fell at odd angles, suggesting the picture had been taken during an unusual time of day. Most peculiar of all, while the rest of the family gazed directly at the camera with the formal expressions typical of the era, young Isabel's eyes seemed to be looking at something just beyond the frame. Sarah made a note to research the Ashford family before the auction. Something about this photograph felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. As she carefully wrapped the frame and set it aside, she noticed a small envelope that had been tucked behind the backing. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age and written in a child's careful handwriting. "My dearest diary," the letter began. "I must write this down before I forget, though I fear no one will believe me. The ribbon that Isabel wears in her hair is not what it appears to be. Mamma says I mustn't speak of such things, but I cannot keep silent any longer. The ribbon moves on its own, and when it does, terrible things happen." The letter was signed Catherine Ashford, July 15, 1906, just 2 days after the photograph had been taken, according to the date penciled on the back of the frame. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read the childish script. She had encountered many family mysteries in her work, but this felt different, more urgent somehow. She decided to postpone her other appraisals and focus on uncovering the story behind the Ashford family photograph. Her first stop was the local historical society, where she hoped to find records of the Ashford family. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Pemberton, brightened when Sarah mentioned the name. "Oh yes, the Ashfords," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tragic family, that one. Lost 3 daughters in the span of just 2 years. Most unusual circumstances, if the old records are to be believed." Mrs. Pemberton led Sarah to a filing cabinet filled with newspaper clippings and official documents from the early 1900s. The first article Sarah found was dated August 3, 1906, just 3 weeks after Catherine's letter. "Mysterious Death at Ashford Estate," the headline read. "Young Catherine Ashford, age 13, found deceased in the family rose garden under circumstances that have baffled local authorities. The girl appears to have become entangled in the garden's climbing roses during the night, sustaining fatal injuries from the thorns. Lord Ashford maintains that his daughter was a careful child who would never have ventured into the garden alone after dark." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the account. The article went on to describe how Catherine had been discovered at dawn by the gardener, her body wrapped so tightly in rose vines that it took several men to free her. The local constable had ruled it an accident, though he noted in his report that the pattern of the vine entanglement was most peculiar and unlike anything I have witnessed in 30 years of service. The constable's detailed report, which Sarah found in a separate file, contained even more disturbing details. The deceased was found with her arms positioned in an unnatural manner, as if she had been reaching for something above her head. The rose vines had wrapped around her body in a spiral pattern, beginning at her feet and ending at her throat. Most curious of all, there were no footprints leading to or from the location where the body was discovered. despite the soft earth around the rose beds. The gardener who had found Catherine's body had provided additional testimony that was recorded in the police files. "I heard Miss Catherine crying out in the night," he had told the investigating officer. "But when I looked from my cottage window, I could see nothing in the garden. The cries stopped suddenly, and I thought perhaps I had been dreaming. It wasn't until dawn that I found her among the roses, wrapped up like a spider's prey." The second article was dated December 12, 1906, just 4 months later. "Second tragedy strikes Ashford family," the headline announced. "Victoria Ashford, eldest daughter of Lord and Lady Ashford, has been found dead in the family's conservatory. The 15-year-old appears to have suffocated after becoming trapped beneath a collapsed section of glass panels. Groundskeepers report that the conservatory had been inspected just days prior and showed no signs of structural weakness." The article included a quote from Lady Margaret Ashford. "My daughters were the light of my life. I cannot understand how such terrible accidents could befall our family. Victoria was to be married in the spring. She had everything to live for." But it was the coroner's report on Victoria's death that truly disturbed Sarah. The official document, filed away in the Historical Society's archives, revealed details that the newspaper had not published. The deceased was found in a seated position beneath the collapsed glass, as if she had been calmly waiting for the structure to fall. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her expression was peaceful, showing no signs of the terror one would expect from such a violent death. Most puzzling, the glass panels that fell were those directly above where she sat, while the rest of the conservatory remained intact. The groundskeeper who had discovered Victoria's body had provided additional testimony that was recorded in the police files. "I heard Miss Victoria talking to someone in the conservatory the night before she died," he had told the investigating officer. "But when I looked through the windows, she appeared to be alone. She was gesturing as if someone was standing right in front of her, and I could swear I heard a second voice, though I couldn't make out the words." A housemaid had also provided testimony about Victoria's behavior in the days leading up to her death. "Miss Victoria had been acting strangely," the maid had said. "She would often be found staring at nothing, as if she were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. When I asked her about it, she would say she was speaking with the lady who watches. I thought it was just her imagination, but now I wonder if there was something more to it." Sarah searched frantically for the third article, dreading what she might find. It was dated March 21, 1907, nearly a year after the photograph had been taken. "Final Ashford daughter perishes in tragic accident," the headline read. Isabel Ashford, the youngest daughter of the prominent Yorkshire family, has died after falling from the tower window of the family estate. Witnesses report that the 11-year-old had been seen playing alone in the tower room, which had been declared off-limits following recent renovations. The child's body was discovered in the courtyard below by her governess. But it was the final paragraph of this article that made Sarah's blood run cold. In a curious detail, young Isabel was found still wearing an elaborate silk ribbon in her hair, tied in an intricate pattern that her governess claims she had never seen before. The ribbon appeared to be the only item of clothing that remained undamaged in the fall. The governess's statement, preserved in the police records, provided even more chilling details. "Miss Isabel had been acting strangely in the weeks before her death," the woman had testified. "She would often be found talking to herself, or rather, talking to someone who wasn't there. When I asked her about it, she would say she was speaking with the lady in the shadows. I thought it was merely a child's imagination, but now I wonder if there was something more to it." The governess had also reported that Isabel had become increasingly obsessed with the ribbon in her hair, refusing to let anyone touch it or remove it, even for washing. "She would become quite agitated if anyone came near the ribbon," the governess had said. "She claimed it was a gift from the lady, and that terrible things would happen if it were ever taken away." A particularly disturbing detail came from the tower room where Isabel had been playing before her death. The investigating officer had noted that the room showed signs of a struggle, with furniture overturned and scratches on the wooden floor. But most puzzling was a message that had been carved into the windowsill, apparently with a child's fingernails. "She makes me do things I don't want to do." Sarah sat back in her chair, trying to process what she had read. 3 sisters, all dead within 8 months of that garden photograph being taken. And in each case there were unusual circumstances that the authorities couldn't fully explain. She returned to Catherine's letter, reading it more carefully this time. The girl had written about the ribbon moving on its own, about terrible things happening when it did. Had Catherine somehow known that disaster was coming? Had she tried to warn someone? Mrs. Pemberton appeared at Sarah's shoulder, having watched her research with growing interest. "Found something troubling, did you?" she asked gently. Sarah showed her the letter and the newspaper articles. Mrs. Pemberton nodded grimly. "I've heard whispers about that ribbon over the years," she said. "My grandmother used to tell stories about it when I was a child. Said it was cursed, brought over from India by Lord Ashford during his military service there." "What kind of stories?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Mrs. Pemberton glanced around the empty library before continuing in a low voice. "According to the tales, Lord Ashford had acquired the ribbon from a temple in Rajasthan after a particularly brutal military campaign. The local priests had warned him that it was sacred, that removing it would bring misfortune to his family. But Ashford was a practical man who didn't believe in such superstitions. He brought it home as a gift for his youngest daughter." Sarah felt a chill as she remembered the photograph. Isabel had indeed been wearing the ribbon, tied in that strange, complex pattern. "The stories say," Mrs. Pemberton continued, "that the ribbon was woven with threads of silk that had been blessed by ancient rituals, but also cursed by the blood of those who died defending the temple. It was meant to bind spirits to the earthly realm, to prevent them from finding peace in death." "And you believe these stories?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Pemberton shrugged. "I believe that 3 young girls died under very strange circumstances, and that their deaths all seem to be connected to that ribbon in some way. Whether you call it a curse or just a series of tragic coincidences, the result was the same." Mrs. Pemberton pulled out another file from her cabinet. "There's more to the story, though. My grandmother also told me about the woman who came to the village just before the first death. A foreign woman dressed in dark robes, who was asking questions about the Ashford family. Some said she was Indian. Others thought she might have been from somewhere else in the East. But everyone agreed that there was something unsettling about her." Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of questions was she asking? About the family's time in India, specifically about any artifacts or religious items they might have brought back. The woman seemed particularly interested in Lord Ashford's military service and the campaigns he had participated in. She visited the local inn for several weeks, always watching the Ashford estate from a distance. Mrs. Pemberton continued. "The strange thing was, after young Catherine died, the woman disappeared. No one saw her leave, and the innkeeper said she had paid for her room through the end of the month, but her belongings were simply gone one morning." The innkeeper's own account, which Mrs. Pemberton found in her files, provided additional details about the mysterious woman. She was elderly, perhaps 60 or 70 years old, but she moved with the grace of someone much younger, he had written in a statement to the local constable. "Her eyes were the most unsettling thing about her. They seemed to see right through you, as if she could read your very soul. She spoke English well, but with a heavy accent that I couldn't place." The innkeeper had also noted that the woman had asked specifically about the Ashford children, particularly the youngest daughter. She wanted to know about their daily routines, where they played, what they wore. "At the time, I thought she might be a distant relative, or perhaps a governess looking for employment. But after the tragedies began, I wondered if there was something more sinister to her interest." Sarah thanked Mrs. Pemberton and left the Historical Society with photocopies of all the articles and documents she had found. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The letter from Catherine suggested that she had witnessed the ribbon moving on its own. But what exactly had she seen? That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment and spread the materials across her dining table. She examined the photograph under a high-powered magnifying glass, studying every detail of the ribbon in Isabel's hair. The pattern was indeed complex, almost like a series of symbols rather than a simple decorative bow. As she studied the image, Sarah noticed something she had missed before. In the background of the photograph, barely visible among the rose bushes, was another figure, a woman in dark clothing, partially obscured by shadows, who appeared to be watching the family from a distance. Sarah enhanced the image using her computer, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out more detail. The figure became slightly clearer, revealing an elderly woman with sharp, angular features and eyes that seemed to stare directly at young Isabel. The woman's clothing appeared to be foreign, possibly Indian, which would fit with Mrs. Pemberton's story about the ribbon's origins. But who was this woman, and why was she watching the Ashford family? Sarah decided she needed to dig deeper into Lord Ashford's military service in India. The next morning, she visited the National Army Museum in London, where she hoped to find records of Lord Ashford's regiment. After several hours of searching through military archives, she found what she was looking for: the service record of Captain Edmund Ashford, who had served with the Royal Yorkshire Regiment in Rajasthan from 1898 to 1903. The records painted a picture of a competent but ruthless officer who had participated in several controversial campaigns against local resistance groups. One particular incident, recorded in a confidential military report, caught Sarah's attention. Captain Ashford's unit was responsible for the siege of the Temple of Kali Mata near Jaipur in October 1902, the report stated. The temple had been used as a stronghold by local insurgents, and Ashford was ordered to clear it by any means necessary. The operation resulted in significant casualties among the temple's defenders, including several women and children who had sought sanctuary there. The report went on to describe how Ashford had ordered his men to remove various artifacts from the temple, including ceremonial items of apparent religious significance. Among the items listed was one silk ribbon, intricately woven and bearing Sanskrit inscriptions, believed to be used in local religious ceremonies. Sarah felt her heart racing as she read this. The ribbon in Isabel's hair was indeed the same one that Lord Ashford had taken from the Indian temple, just as Mrs. Pemberton's grandmother had claimed. But the most disturbing part of the military report came in its final paragraph. Local survivors of the temple siege have made repeated threats against Captain Ashford and his family, claiming that the removal of sacred artifacts will bring divine retribution. While such threats are common in this region and are not considered credible by military authorities, Captain Ashford has been advised to exercise caution upon his return to England. The report included additional details about the temple siege that had not been mentioned in the summary. The Temple of Kali Mata was defended primarily by women and elderly priests, as the younger men had already fled or been killed in previous engagements. Captain Ashford's forces encountered fierce resistance, despite the defenders' limited numbers. The temple's high priestess, identified as Kamala Devi, was reportedly seen performing some kind of ritual, even as the British forces breached the inner sanctum. Witnesses described her as binding various sacred objects with silk cords while chanting in an unknown dialect. The report continued. After the temple was secured, Captain Ashford personally supervised the removal of artifacts. The high priestess, though mortally wounded, managed to speak to Ashford before her death. According to the translator present, she warned that the sacred bonds cannot be broken by theft, only by blood and sorrow. She specifically mentioned that the silk ribbon Ashford had taken was woven with the spirits of the faithful and would follow him and his bloodline until justice was served. A separate intelligence report, filed by a different officer, provided even more disturbing details about the aftermath of the temple siege. In the weeks following the operation, several members of Captain Ashford's unit reported strange occurrences. Sentries claimed to see figures in white robes moving through the camp at night, though no intruders were ever found. Some men reported hearing chanting in the local dialect, even when no natives were present. Most disturbing, 3 soldiers died under mysterious circumstances. One was found strangled in his tent with no signs of struggle, another fell from a watchtower despite being an experienced climber, and a third drowned in a shallow stream that should not have posed any danger. Sarah realized that the mysterious woman in the photograph might have been one of these survivors, someone who had followed Lord Ashford back to England to reclaim the stolen ribbon or to ensure that the threatened retribution came to pass. She returned to the photograph, studying the shadowy figure more carefully. The woman's posture suggested she was elderly, but there was something predatory about the way she watched the family. Her hands were raised slightly, as if she were performing some kind of gesture or ritual. Sarah decided to research the specific temple that Lord Ashford had attacked. Using the location mentioned in the military report, she found references to the Temple of Kali Mata in several academic papers about colonial-era religious conflicts in Rajasthan. One paper, written by Dr. Priya Sharma of the University of Delhi, provided detailed information about the temple's history and significance. According to Dr. Sharma's research, the temple had been dedicated to Kali, the Hindu goddess of time, change, and destruction. The priests there had been known for their mastery of ancient binding rituals, ceremonies designed to tie spirits to physical objects so that they could continue to influence the living world even after death. The silk ribbon that Lord Ashford had stolen was described in temple records as the Raksha Bandhan of Kali, a sacred cord that had been blessed in a ritual designed to bind the spirits of the temple's defenders to the earthly realm. According to the beliefs of the temple's priests, anyone who wore the ribbon would become a vessel for these bound spirits, allowing them to exact revenge on those who had wronged them. Sharma's paper included a chilling detail. The binding ritual was considered so powerful that the temple's high priestess, Kamala Devi, was said to have tied her own spirit to the ribbon before the final assault, ensuring that she would be able to pursue her enemies even beyond death. The academic paper also contained translations of ancient texts that described the specific properties of the Raksha Bandhan of Kali. The sacred cord, when properly consecrated, becomes a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Those who wear it unwillingly become conduits for the spirits bound within, allowing the dead to influence events in the physical world. The binding is so strong that it can persist for generations, passing from one family member to another until the original wrong is avenged. Dr. Sharma had also included excerpts from the personal diary of a British officer who had witnessed the temple siege. The sight of the high priestess performing her final ritual will haunt me for the rest of my days, the officer had written. Even as our bullets found their mark, she continued her chanting, weaving that accursed ribbon with threads of silver and gold. As she died, I could swear I saw spirits flowing into the ribbon, binding themselves to its silk fibers. Captain Ashford took it as a trophy, but I fear he has claimed something far more dangerous than he realizes. Sarah felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. If the academic research was accurate, then Isabel Ashford had been wearing a ribbon that contained the bound spirit of a vengeful priestess, a woman whose temple had been destroyed and whose people had been killed by Isabel's own father. She looked again at the photograph, focusing on young Isabel's expression. The girl's eyes held a strange, distant look, as if she were seeing something that the others couldn't perceive. Her hands were positioned oddly as well, almost as if she were being controlled by some external force. Sarah decided she needed to learn more about what had happened to the Ashford family after Isabel's death. She returned to the Historical Society and asked Mrs. Pemberton if there were any records of Lord and Lady Ashford's later years. "Oh yes," Mrs. Pemberton said sadly. "They never recovered from losing their daughters. Lord Ashford became a recluse, spending most of his time locked in his study. Lady Margaret suffered what we would now call a nervous breakdown. She was institutionalized in 1908 and died there 5 years later. And Lord Ashford? He died in 1910, just 3 years after Isabel. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but the servants whispered that he had been found in his study with a look of absolute terror on his face. Some said he had been talking to someone in the room, though no one else was there." Mrs. Pemberton paused, then added quietly, "There was one other thing. After Lord Ashford's death, the estate was sold to pay debts, but the new owners reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Servants would quit without notice, claiming they had seen the figures of 3 young girls wandering the gardens at night. The property changed hands several times over the next few decades, but no family ever stayed for more than a year or two. What happened to the estate eventually? It was demolished in 1965. The land was turned into a housing development, but even then, the troubles continued. Families would move into the houses built on the former estate grounds and report similar phenomena. The sounds of children playing in their gardens at night, glimpses of figures in white dresses among the flowers. Mrs. Pemberton pulled out another thick file. "I have testimonies from several families who lived on the estate grounds over the years. Would you like to read them?" Sarah nodded, and Mrs. Pemberton handed her a collection of letters and statements dating from the 1920s through the 1960s. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing encounters with 3 young girls in old-fashioned white dresses who would appear in gardens and courtyards, always at dusk or during the night. One letter, dated 1934, was from a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, who had lived in the estate's former carriage house with her family. "My children often spoke of playing with 3 girls in the garden," she wrote. "At first I thought they were referring to neighborhood children, but when I asked around, no one knew of any girls matching their descriptions." The children said the girls wore old-fashioned dresses and spoke in a peculiar way, using words and phrases that seemed to come from another time. Another account, from 1947, described a more disturbing encounter. "I was working in my garden one evening when I heard children's voices coming from the rose bushes," wrote a man named Thomas Hartwell. "When I investigated, I found 3 young girls standing among the flowers. They appeared to be solid and real, but there was something unsettling about them. Their skin was pale as moonlight, and their eyes held a sadness that seemed far too deep for children. When I called out to them, they simply faded away like mist." The most detailed account came from a family who had lived on the grounds in the 1950s. Margaret and Robert Whitfield had documented their experiences in a series of letters to the local parish priest, seeking help with what they believed to be a haunting. "The 3 girls appear most often during the summer months," Margaret Whitfield had written. "They seem to be drawn to areas where flowers are growing, particularly roses. Our own children have spoken with them on several occasions, and the girls have told them their names: Catherine, Victoria, and Isabel. They claim to be waiting for someone to help them untie the knots that bind them to this place." Robert Whitfield's letter provided additional details. "The youngest girl, who calls herself Isabel, always wears a ribbon in her hair. The ribbon appears to be made of silk and is tied in an intricate pattern that seems to shift and change when you're not looking directly at it. Our daughter tried to touch the ribbon once, but the girl became agitated and warned her not to, saying that the lady in the shadows would be angry." A particularly disturbing account came from a family who had lived on the estate grounds in the early 1960s. The Hendersons had reported not just sightings of the 3 girls, but actual interactions that had left them deeply shaken. "Our son Timothy, who was 8 at the time, came home one evening, claiming that he had been playing with 3 girls in the old rose garden," Mrs. Henderson had written to the local newspaper. "He said they had taught him a game involving tying knots in pieces of string, and that the youngest girl, Isabel, had shown him how to make the knots come alive. When I asked him to demonstrate, he tied a piece of string in a complex pattern that seemed to move on its own. I was so frightened that I threw the string into the fire, and Timothy began screaming that the lady would be angry." The Henderson account continued with even more disturbing details. "That night, Timothy developed a high fever and began speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. He kept repeating the same phrases over and over: Raksha Bandhan, Kali Mata, and justice must be served. We had no idea what these words meant at the time, but they seemed to cause him great distress. The fever broke after 3 days, and Timothy had no memory of what had happened, but he refused to go near the old rose garden ever again." Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. If the stories were true, then the spirits of the 3 Ashford sisters were still tied to the location where they had died, unable to find peace because of the cursed ribbon that had bound them to the earthly realm. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. What had happened to the ribbon itself after Isabel's death? Mrs. Pemberton consulted her files again. According to the estate inventory taken after Lord Ashford's death, most of his personal effects were sold at auction. But there's a note here that some items were donated to the local church, including various personal effects of the deceased daughters. Sarah's heart leaped. If the ribbon had been donated to the church, there might be a record of what had become of it. The next morning she visited St. Mary's Church in the village, near the former Ashford estate. The current vicar, Reverend Thompson, was a young man who had only recently taken over the parish, but he was eager to help with Sarah's research. "We do have some old records in the church archives," he said, leading her to a small room behind the altar. Most of the items donated by the Ashford estate were distributed to needy families in the parish, but a few pieces were kept here for historical purposes. Reverend Thompson showed Sarah to a glass display case that contained various artifacts from the church's history. Among them was a small silk ribbon, faded with age but still showing traces of the intricate pattern that Sarah recognized from the photograph. "That's been here as long as anyone can remember," Reverend Thompson said. "The previous vicar, Father Mackenzie, used to tell stories about it, said it had come from the Ashford family, and that strange things happened whenever anyone tried to move it." "What kind of strange things?" Reverend Thompson looked uncomfortable. Well, Father Mackenzie claimed that anyone who touched the ribbon would have vivid nightmares about 3 young girls. He said the dreams were so disturbing that he eventually had the case sealed and forbade anyone from opening it. Sarah stared at the ribbon through the glass. Even now, more than a century after the photograph had been taken, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The pattern of knots was exactly as she remembered from the image of Isabel, complex and almost hypnotic in its intricacy. "Has anyone reported seeing the Ashford girls recently?" Sarah asked. Reverend Thompson nodded reluctantly. "Actually, yes. Just last month, a family visiting the church claimed they saw 3 girls in old-fashioned white dresses playing in the churchyard. When they approached to ask if the children were lost, the figures simply vanished." Sarah felt a chill. The spirits of the 3 sisters were still active, still bound to the earthly realm by the cursed ribbon that now sat just a few feet away from her. As Sarah continued to study the ribbon through the glass case, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The intricate knots that formed the pattern seemed to be moving slightly, shifting and rearranging themselves in a slow, hypnotic dance. She blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light, but when she looked again, the movement was still there. "Reverend Thompson," she said carefully, "I believe that ribbon is extremely dangerous. Based on my research, it's connected to the deaths of the 3 Ashford sisters, and it may be preventing their spirits from finding peace." The young vicar looked skeptical. "You're not seriously suggesting that a piece of cloth is haunted, are you?" Sarah showed him the photograph and the documents she had gathered. As Reverend Thompson read through the evidence, his expression grew increasingly troubled. When he finished, he looked up at the ribbon in its case with new understanding. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said finally, "what can we do about it? The ribbon has been here for over a century. It's part of the church's history now." "I think it needs to be returned to where it came from," Sarah said. "According to my research, it was stolen from a temple in India. If we can get it back to its original location, the binding spell might be broken and the spirits of the Ashford sisters can finally find peace." Before Reverend Thompson could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion outside the church. Through the windows they could see a small crowd gathering in the churchyard, all pointing at something near the old section of the cemetery. They hurried outside to investigate and found the crowd staring at 3 fresh graves that had appeared overnight in a section of the churchyard that had been empty the day before. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, and carved into each cross was a name: Catherine Ashford, Victoria Ashford, Isabel Ashford. "This is impossible," Reverend Thompson whispered. "These graves weren't here yesterday, and the Ashford sisters were buried in the family plot on their estate over a century ago." An elderly woman from the crowd stepped forward. "I saw them," she said in a shaky voice. "Last night, around midnight. 3 young girls in white dresses, digging in the earth with their bare hands. When I called out to them, they looked up at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen, then just faded away like mist." Sarah knelt beside the graves and noticed that the earth was disturbed in a very specific pattern. The soil had been arranged in the same intricate design as the knots in the ribbon, as if the sisters were trying to communicate something through the very ground they had dug. "So they're trying to tell us something," Sarah said, studying the pattern. "This design matches the ribbon exactly. I think they're showing us that they're still bound to it, still trapped by its power." As if in response to her words, a cold wind suddenly swept through the churchyard. Despite the fact that the day had been perfectly calm, the wind seemed to emanate from the 3 graves, carrying with it the faint sound of children's voices singing a lullaby. The crowd dispersed quickly, frightened by the supernatural display, but Sarah remained by the graves listening to the ethereal song. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but filled with an overwhelming sadness that brought tears to her eyes. "They're suffering," she said to Reverend Thompson, who had stayed beside her. "After all these years, they're still suffering because of that ribbon." That night, Sarah had the most vivid dream of her life. She found herself standing in the rose garden of the Ashford estate, as it had appeared in 1906, but the scene was different from the photograph. The 3 sisters were there, but they were not posing for a picture. Instead, they were running through the garden, their white dresses flowing behind them as they played a game of tag among the flowers. Catherine was laughing as she chased Victoria around the fountain, while little Isabel sat on the edge of the stone basin, clapping her hands in delight. It was a scene of pure childhood joy, unmarred by the tragedy that would soon befall them. But as Sarah watched, the scene began to change. The sky darkened, and the roses in the garden began to wither and die. The laughter of the children turned to cries of fear as thorny vines erupted from the ground, reaching out to ensnare them. "Help us!" Catherine called out to Sarah, her voice echoing across the years. "We've been trapped for so long, the ribbon won't let us go." Sarah tried to run toward the children, but her feet felt like they were stuck in thick mud. She could only watch helplessly as the vines wrapped around Catherine, pulling her down into the earth. Victoria tried to help her sister, but was caught by the collapsing glass of an invisible conservatory that materialized around her. Isabel, still wearing the cursed ribbon in her hair, was lifted into the air by an unseen force and carried toward a tower that had appeared at the edge of the garden. "Break the binding," Isabel called out as she was pulled away. "Return what was stolen. Only then can we be free." But the dream didn't end there. As Sarah watched in horror, the scene shifted to show her the temple in India where the ribbon had been stolen. She saw Lord Ashford and his soldiers breaking down the doors, saw the defenders fighting desperately to protect their sacred space, and she saw the High Priestess, Kamala Devi, performing her final ritual as the British forces closed in. The priestess held the silk ribbon in her hands, chanting words in Sanskrit as she wove it with threads of silver and gold. "By blood and spirit, by earth and fire," she intoned, "let this sacred bond endure until justice is served. Let the guilty know no peace until what was stolen is returned." As the priestess spoke these words, Sarah could see spirits flowing into the ribbon, binding themselves to its silk fibers. The priestess herself was the last to enter the ribbon, her spirit merging with the sacred cord just as Lord Ashford's sword struck her down. The dream continued, showing Sarah the aftermath of the temple siege. She saw the mysterious woman from the photograph, who she now realized was one of the temple's surviving priestesses, following Lord Ashford back to England. The woman had spent years tracking the stolen ribbon, waiting for the right moment to ensure that the curse would take effect. Sarah watched as the woman performed her own ritual in the shadows of the Ashford estate, strengthening the binding that tied the ribbon to the spirits of the dead. She saw how the woman had influenced young Isabel, teaching her to tie the ribbon in the specific pattern that would activate its power. The dream showed Sarah the true horror of what had happened to the three sisters. They had not simply died in accidents. They had been possessed by the vengeful spirits bound to the ribbon, forced to act out the priestess's desire for revenge against Lord Ashford's bloodline. Catherine had been compelled to walk into the rose garden at night, where the spirits had used the thorny vines to strangle her. Victoria had been forced to sit calmly in the conservatory while the spirits caused the glass panels to collapse upon her. And Isabel, the primary vessel for the priestess's spirit, had been driven to throw herself from the tower window when the possession became too much for her young mind to bear. Sarah woke with a gasp, her heart pounding and her sheets soaked with sweat. The dream had been so real that she could still smell the roses and hear the echo of the children's voices. She knew now what she had to do. The next morning, she returned to the church and found Reverend Thompson in his office, looking haggard and exhausted. "I didn't sleep a wink last night," he said when he saw her. "I kept hearing children's voices coming from the churchyard. And the ribbon in the display case. I swear it was glowing with a faint light every time I looked at it. The sisters visited me in a dream," Sarah said, and she told him about her vivid experience in the rose garden and the temple in India. "They're begging for help. We have to return that ribbon to India." Reverend Thompson was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the three mysterious graves that had appeared in his churchyard. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't belong here. If returning it to India will give those poor souls peace, then that's what we must do." Sarah contacted Dr. Priya Sharma, the academic who had written about the temple of Kali Mata, and explained the situation. Dr. Sharma was fascinated by Sarah's discoveries and agreed to help facilitate the ribbon's return to India. "What you're describing sounds like a classic case of spiritual binding," Dr. Sharma said during their video call. "The ancient priests of Kali were masters of such rituals. If the ribbon was indeed blessed in the way you've described, it would be incredibly powerful. The fact that it has maintained its hold over these spirits for more than a century is remarkable, but also deeply troubling." Dr. Sharma arranged for the ribbon to be transported to a temple in Rajasthan that was connected to the original temple of Kali Mata, where priests who were trained in the ancient rituals could properly dispose of it. But she warned Sarah that the process would not be simple. Breaking a binding of this strength will require a complex ceremony, she explained. The priests will need to perform rituals that have not been used in over a century, and there's always a risk that the spirits bound to the ribbon will resist being freed. Sometimes after being trapped for so long, they forget what it means to be at peace. The preparation for the ceremony took several weeks. Dr. Sharma worked with the temple priests to gather the necessary materials and to study ancient texts that described the proper procedures for breaking spiritual bindings. Meanwhile, Sarah documented everything she had learned about the Ashford family and the cursed ribbon, creating a complete record of her investigation. During this time, the supernatural activity around the former Ashford estate intensified. The 3 graves in the churchyard began to emit a soft, phosphorescent glow at night, and several residents reported seeing the ghostly figures of 3 young girls walking through the streets after midnight. But these sightings were different from the previous ones. Instead of appearing sad and desperate, the spirits seemed hopeful, almost excited. They were often seen holding hands and skipping together, as if they knew that their long imprisonment was finally coming to an end. Sarah received regular updates from Dr. Sharma about the preparations in India. The priests are taking this very seriously, she reported. They say the ribbon is one of the most powerful examples of spiritual binding they have ever encountered. The energy emanating from it is so strong that they've had to keep it in a specially consecrated chamber to prevent it from affecting the other artifacts in the temple. The priests had also discovered additional information about the original binding ritual performed by Kamala Devi. According to ancient temple records that had been preserved in secret archives, the high priestess had not only bound her own spirit to the ribbon, but had also woven into it the spirits of all the temple's defenders who had died during the British assault. This means, Dr. Sharma explained, that the ribbon contains not just one vengeful spirit, but dozens. The binding was designed to ensure that the theft of the sacred artifact would bring suffering to the thief and his descendants until justice was served. The fact that 3 innocent children died as a result shows just how powerful and indiscriminate such curses can be. As the date for the cleansing ceremony approached, Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to the church where the ribbon was kept. Each time she visited, she could feel the presence of the 3 sisters more strongly, as if they were gathering their strength for the final confrontation with the forces that had held them captive for so long. Reverend Thompson reported that the ribbon's activity was increasing as well. "It's definitely moving now," he told Sarah during one of her visits. "I can see the knots shifting and changing even when I'm not looking directly at it. And the temperature around the display case has dropped significantly. I've had to move the case to a storage room because it was making the congregation uncomfortable." The night before the ribbon was to be shipped to India, Sarah experienced another vivid dream. This time, she found herself standing in the temple courtyard in Rajasthan, watching as the priests prepared for the cleansing ceremony. The ribbon lay on a silver altar in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by burning incense and sacred symbols drawn in colored sand. As the ceremony began, Sarah could see spirits beginning to emerge from the ribbon, not just the 3 Ashford sisters, but dozens of other figures in traditional Indian dress. These were the temple defenders who had died protecting their sacred space, their spirits bound to the ribbon by Kamala Devi's final ritual. At the center of the group stood the high priestess herself, her form more solid and defined than the others. She looked directly at Sarah and spoke in accented English. The children were never meant to suffer. They were innocent of their father's crimes. But the binding could not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. When the sacred cord is destroyed, all spirits will be freed, both the defenders of the temple and the daughters of the thief. Sarah woke from this dream with a sense of profound sadness, but also hope. The ceremony would not only free the Ashford sisters, but would also release the spirits of the temple defenders, allowing all of them to find the peace that had been denied to them for over a century. The cleansing ceremony was scheduled for the night of the new moon, when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was said to be at its thinnest. Dr. Sharma arranged for Sarah to witness the ritual via video call so she could see the culmination of her investigation. As the ceremony began, Sarah watched from her apartment as 5 priests gathered around a sacred fire in the temple courtyard. The ribbon had been placed on a silver tray in the center of the circle. and even through the computer screen Sarah could see that it was moving, writhing like a living thing as the priests began their chants. The ritual was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The priests spoke in ancient Sanskrit, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to resonate with otherworldly power. Smoke from the sacred fire began to take on strange shapes, forming images of temples, battles, and figures in flowing robes. As the ceremony reached its climax, the ribbon on the silver tray began to glow with an intense red light. The glow grew brighter and brighter until Sarah had to shield her eyes from the screen. Through the brilliant light, she could see shapes moving within the ribbon, human figures that seemed to be struggling to break free from invisible bonds. Suddenly, the light exploded outward, filling the entire temple courtyard with a blinding radiance. When it faded, the ribbon was gone, dissolved into nothing more than a small pile of ash on the silver tray. But the ceremony wasn't over. As the priests continued their chants, 3 columns of soft, golden light appeared in the air above where the ribbon had been. Within each column, Sarah could see the figure of a young girl in a white dress. The figures were no longer translucent or ghostly. They appeared solid and real, as if they were truly present in the temple courtyard. The 3 Ashford sisters looked around in wonder, as if seeing the world clearly for the first time in over a century. They smiled at each other and joined hands, their faces radiant with joy and relief. Then, as the priest spoke the final words of the ceremony, the 3 sisters looked directly at the camera, as if they could see Sarah watching from thousands of miles away. Catherine, the eldest, mouthed the words "thank you" one final time. Then all 3 sisters turned toward a brilliant doorway of light that had appeared at the edge of the temple courtyard. Hand in hand they walked through the doorway and disappeared, finally free to continue their journey to whatever lay beyond the physical world. But they were not alone. As Sarah watched in amazement, dozens of other figures emerged from the fading light, the spirits of the temple defenders, who had also been bound to the ribbon. Led by the high priestess Kamala Devi, they too walked through the doorway of light, their long vigil finally at an end. The priests concluded the ceremony by scattering the ashes of the ribbon into the sacred fire, ensuring that no trace of its power remained. Dr. Sharma later reported that the temple felt completely different after the ritual, as if a great weight had been lifted from the very stones of the building. Back in England, the effects of the ceremony were immediately apparent. The 3 mysterious graves in the churchyard vanished overnight, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. The reports of ghostly sightings in the village stopped completely, and residents noted that the atmosphere in the area felt lighter and more peaceful than it had in decades. Sarah received confirmation from Dr. Sharma that the ceremony had been successful. "The priests were amazed by what they witnessed," she wrote in her email. "They said it was one of the most powerful spiritual liberations they had ever performed. The binding had been incredibly strong, but the spirit's desire for freedom was even stronger. They are at peace now, finally able to continue their journey." Reverend Thompson called Sarah the next morning with news that brought tears to her eyes. "The most extraordinary thing happened last night," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I was walking through the churchyard around midnight when I heard children's laughter coming from the direction where those graves had appeared. But this time the laughter was joyful, not sad. When I looked toward the sound, I saw 3 young girls in white dresses playing in a circle of golden light. They saw me watching and waved goodbye before the light faded, and they disappeared. I think they were saying farewell." Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The investigation that had begun with a simple estate photograph had led to the liberation of 3 innocent souls who had been trapped for over a century. The Ashford sisters were finally free, and the curse that had plagued their family and the surrounding area had been broken. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself drawn to research other cases of cultural artifacts that might have been taken inappropriately from their original contexts. The Ashford case had opened her eyes to the potential consequences of cultural insensitivity and the importance of respecting the sacred beliefs of other cultures. She began working with museums and cultural institutions to help identify objects that might need to be returned to their places of origin. Each case reminded her of the 3 sisters in the garden and of the lesson their story had taught her about the responsibility that comes with handling historical artifacts. The photograph that had started it all was eventually donated to the Historical Society, along with a complete account of Sarah's investigation and the story of the cursed ribbon. Mrs. Pemberton was delighted to add the Ashford collection to the Society's archives. "This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be preserved," she said, "not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of the consequences of taking sacred objects from their cultural context and of the power of making things right, even after more than a century has passed." Sarah kept a copy of the garden photograph on her desk as a reminder of the investigation that had changed her perspective on her work. No longer did she see estate photographs as simple historical artifacts. Each image potentially contained stories of love, loss, tragedy, and hope, stories that deserved to be told and remembered. Years later, when Sarah had become recognized as an expert in cultural repatriation and historical investigation, she would often tell the story of the Ashford sisters to her colleagues and students. It had become her signature case, the investigation that had defined her career and her understanding of the responsibility that comes with handling historical artifacts. The case had also led to important changes in how cultural artifacts were handled by auction houses and museums. Sarah's detailed documentation of the Ashford investigation became a model for other researchers, showing how careful investigation and cultural sensitivity could help right historical wrongs and bring peace to troubled spirits. Dr. Sharma continued to collaborate with Sarah on other cases involving artifacts taken from Indian temples during the colonial period. Together, they helped facilitate the return of dozens of sacred objects to their rightful places, each repatriation ceremony bringing closure to communities that had been separated from their cultural heritage for generations. The temple in Rajasthan, where the ribbon had been destroyed, became a center for research into spiritual binding rituals and their effects. The priests there, inspired by the successful liberation of the Ashford sisters, began working to identify other artifacts that might be holding spirits in bondage, hoping to free them through similar ceremonies. Sarah often thought about the three sisters in the months and years that followed their liberation. Their story had become more than just a historical investigation. It had become a testament to the power of persistence, compassion, and the willingness to right historical wrongs, no matter how much time had passed. The ribbon that had tied more than just Isabel's hair had finally been untied, and with it, the bonds that had held three innocent souls captive for over a century. The sisters were free to be children again, to play and laugh and love without the shadow of their father's greed hanging over them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings in her apartment, Sarah would look at the photograph of the three sisters in their garden and smile, knowing that somewhere beyond the veil of death, Catherine, Victoria, and Isabel Ashford were finally at peace, free to continue their journey into whatever lay beyond this world. The photograph still hung in her office, a reminder of the three young lives that had been lost to their father's cultural insensitivity, but also of the power of justice and compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. And sometimes, when the light hit the glass of the frame just right, Sarah could swear she saw the faint outlines of three young girls in white dresses, standing in a garden that existed now only in memory, finally free to play and laugh and be children again. The case of the Ashford sisters had taught Sarah that some mysteries are meant to be solved, not for the sake of knowledge alone, but for the sake of justice and compassion. The three young girls who had died so tragically in 1906 and 1907 had waited patiently for over a century for someone to understand their plight and help them find the peace they deserved. In the end, it had been a simple photograph in an estate auction that had led to their liberation. Sarah often wondered how many other images in archives and private collections might contain similar stories, waiting for someone with the patience and compassion to uncover the truth hidden within their frames. The Ashford family tragedy had become a part of Sarah's life in a way she had never expected. Each new case she took on was approached with the same careful attention to detail and cultural sensitivity that had made the Ashford investigation successful. She had learned that every artifact, every photograph, every piece of historical evidence had the potential to tell a story that needed to be heard. The three sisters had found their peace, but their story lived on as a reminder of the importance of respecting other cultures and the sacred objects that hold deep meaning for communities around the world. Their liberation had been a victory not just for their individual spirits, but for the principle that historical wrongs can be righted, no matter how much time has passed. Sarah's work in cultural repatriation expanded significantly following the Ashford case. She established a foundation dedicated to identifying and returning stolen cultural artifacts to their countries of origin. The foundation, which she named the Ashford Sisters Memorial Trust, became a leading voice in the movement to address the legacy of colonial-era cultural theft. The Trust's first major success came just 2 years after the ribbon ceremony, when Sarah helped facilitate the return of a collection of sacred masks that had been taken from a village in Papua New Guinea during the early 1900s. The ceremony to welcome the masks home was attended by hundreds of villagers, many of whom wept openly as their ancestral spirits were finally allowed to return to their sacred ground. Dr. Sharma became the Trust's chief advisor on South Asian artifacts, and together she and Sarah developed protocols for identifying objects that might be spiritually significant to their communities of origin. They created a database of stolen temple artifacts that became an invaluable resource for museums and collectors seeking to verify the provenance of their holdings. One particularly significant case involved a collection of Tibetan prayer wheels that had been acquired by a British collector in the 1920s. The wheels had been taken from a monastery that was later destroyed during political upheavals, making them some of the last remaining artifacts from that sacred site. When the wheels were returned to the Tibetan community in exile, the monks who received them reported that they could feel the presence of their departed brothers, finally able to rest in peace. Sarah's reputation as an expert in spiritually significant artifacts led to consulting work with major museums around the world. She helped the British Museum identify several objects in their collection that needed to be returned to their communities of origin, and worked with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to develop new acquisition policies that would prevent the purchase of potentially stolen cultural artifacts. But it was the smaller, more personal cases that reminded Sarah most strongly of the Ashford sisters. There was the Native American medicine bundle that had been sitting in a private collection for decades, its spiritual power slowly fading as it remained separated from its people. When it was finally returned to the tribal elders, they performed a ceremony to reawaken its sacred energy, and several participants reported visions of ancestors who had been waiting for the bundle's return. Another case involved a collection of African masks that had been acquired by a European explorer in the early 1900s. The masks represented the spirits of village ancestors, and their theft had left the community spiritually incomplete for generations. When the masks were returned, the village held a celebration that lasted for 3 days, welcoming their ancestors home with dancing, singing, and ritual offerings. Each successful repatriation reinforced Sarah's belief that cultural artifacts are more than just historical objects. They are living connections to the spiritual and cultural heritage of their communities. The Ashford case had taught her that when these connections are severed through theft or cultural insensitivity, the consequences can be profound and long-lasting. Sarah also began working with law enforcement agencies to help identify stolen cultural artifacts that appeared on the international art market. Her expertise in recognizing spiritually significant objects proved invaluable in several high-profile cases, including the recovery of a collection of sacred Aboriginal artifacts that had been stolen from an Australian museum. The Foundation's work attracted the attention of academic institutions around the world, and Sarah was invited to lecture at universities on the ethical implications of cultural artifact collection. Her presentations always began with the story of the Ashford sisters, using their tragedy as a powerful example of the human cost of cultural insensitivity. Students were particularly moved by the photograph of the 3 girls in their garden, and many went on to pursue careers in cultural preservation and repatriation. Sarah took pride in knowing that the sisters' story was inspiring a new generation of scholars and activists to approach cultural heritage with the respect and sensitivity it deserved. The Trust also established a scholarship program for students from communities that had been affected by cultural artifact theft. The scholarships enabled young people to study museum science, archaeology, and cultural preservation, ensuring that their communities would have the expertise needed to protect and preserve their cultural heritage for future generations. As the years passed, Sarah received regular updates from Dr. Sharma about the temple in Rajasthan, where the ribbon ceremony had taken place. The temple had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking to heal from spiritual trauma, and the priests there had developed new rituals based on the ancient binding-breaking ceremony that had freed the Ashford sisters. The temple also became a center for research into the spiritual properties of cultural artifacts. Scholars from around the world came to study the ancient texts that described binding rituals and their effects, hoping to better understand how cultural objects could hold and transmit spiritual energy across generations. Dr. Sharma published several academic papers about the Ashford case, which became required reading in courses on cultural anthropology and museum ethics. Her work helped establish new academic frameworks for understanding the spiritual significance of cultural artifacts and the importance of maintaining their connection to their communities of origin. The village where the Ashford estate had once stood also underwent a transformation. The local historical society, inspired by Sarah's investigation, established a memorial garden on the site where the house had been demolished. The garden featured 3 rose beds, each dedicated to one of the Ashford sisters, and a plaque that told their story and honored their memory. The memorial became a place of reflection and remembrance, visited by people from around the world who had been touched by the sisters' story. Many visitors left flowers or small tokens of remembrance, and several reported feeling a sense of peace and closure after spending time in the garden. Mrs. Pemberton, who had helped Sarah with her initial research, lived to see the memorial garden's dedication. Though she was in her 80s by then, she spoke movingly at the ceremony about the importance of remembering the past and learning from its tragedies. The Ashford sisters were victims of their father's ignorance and greed, she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. But their story has become a beacon of hope, showing us that it's never too late to make things right, never too late to seek justice for those who have been wronged. Sarah kept in touch with Reverend Thompson, who had played such a crucial role in facilitating the ribbon's return to India. The young vicar had been profoundly affected by his experience with the supernatural, and he went on to study the intersection of spirituality and cultural heritage. He eventually became a leading voice in the Church of England's efforts to address the legacy of colonialism and cultural appropriation. The church, where the ribbon had been kept for over a century, was renovated and rededicated as a center for interfaith dialogue and cultural understanding. The display case that had once held the cursed ribbon now contained artifacts from various religious traditions, all properly acquired and displayed with the full consent and blessing of their communities of origin. As Sarah approached her 60th birthday, she began to think about her legacy and the future of the work she had started. The Ashford Sisters Memorial Trust had grown into an international organization with offices in London, New Delhi, New York, and Sydney. The foundation had facilitated the return of hundreds of cultural artifacts to their communities of origin, and had helped establish new international protocols for the ethical acquisition and display of cultural objects. Sarah decided to write a book about her experiences, using the Ashford case as the central narrative, but weaving in stories from the many other repatriation cases she had worked on. The book, titled The Ribbon That Bound Us, A Journey Through Cultural Memory and Spiritual Healing, became an international bestseller and was translated into dozens of languages. The book's success brought even more attention to the issue of cultural artifact repatriation, and several governments established new programs to identify and return stolen cultural objects. The European Union passed legislation requiring member countries to actively search their museum collections for artifacts that might need to be returned to their communities of origin. Sarah used the proceeds from her book to establish an endowment that would ensure the Ashford Sisters Memorial Trust could continue its work in perpetuity. She also created a research institute dedicated to studying the spiritual and cultural significance of artifacts, with the goal of developing new methods for identifying objects that might be holding spiritual energy or causing harm through their separation from their communities. The Institute's first major project was a comprehensive survey of museum collections around the world, using both traditional scholarship and newer techniques like spiritual consultation with indigenous elders and religious leaders. The survey identified thousands of artifacts that potentially needed to be returned to their communities of origin, providing a roadmap for decades of future repatriation work. On the 20th anniversary of the ribbon ceremony, Sarah returned to the temple in Rajasthan, where the Ashford sisters had finally found their freedom. The temple had grown significantly since her last visit, with new buildings dedicated to research and spiritual healing. The courtyard where the ceremony had taken place was now marked with a memorial stone that told the story of the three sisters and the importance of cultural respect and understanding. Dr. Sharma, now in her 70s but still actively involved in repatriation work, joined Sarah for the anniversary ceremony. Together, they lit incense and offered prayers for all the spirits who had been freed through their work, and for those who were still waiting for justice and peace. As they stood in the temple courtyard, Sarah felt a familiar presence, not the troubled spirits of the past, but something peaceful and grateful. She looked up at the clear blue sky and whispered a quiet thank you to Catherine, Victoria, and Isabel Ashford, whose tragic story had changed the course of her life and the lives of so many others. The ceremony concluded with the planting of 3 rose bushes in the temple garden, each one representing one of the Ashford sisters. The roses were a variety that had been cultivated in Yorkshire during the Edwardian era, a living connection between the temple in India and the English garden where the sisters had once played. As Sarah watched the temple priests tend to the newly planted roses, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with a simple photograph in an auction house basement, but it had led to a lifetime of work dedicated to healing the wounds of cultural insensitivity and bringing peace to troubled spirits. The ribbon that had tied more than just Isabel's hair had indeed been untied, but its legacy lived on in the work of the Foundation, the Research Institute, and the countless individuals who had been inspired by the sisters' story to approach cultural heritage with greater respect and understanding. Sarah knew that her work was far from over. There were still thousands of cultural artifacts scattered around the world, separated from their communities, and potentially causing spiritual harm through their displacement. But she also knew that the movement she had helped to start would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by the students she had taught, the colleagues she had inspired, and the communities she had helped to heal. As the sun set over the temple courtyard, casting long shadows across the memorial stone, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction and peace. The 3 Ashford sisters had finally found their rest, but their story would continue to inspire others to seek justice, to right historical wrongs, and to treat the cultural heritage of all peoples with the respect and reverence it deserved. The photograph that had started it all still hung in Sarah's office, a reminder of the power of persistence, compassion, and the willingness to listen to the voices of the past. And sometimes, when the light hit the glass just right, she could still see the faint outlines of 3 young girls in white dresses, no longer trapped in a world of sorrow, but free to dance in gardens of eternal spring, their ribbon finally untied, their spirits finally at peace. In the end, that was all that mattered, that justice had been served, that peace had been restored, and that 3 innocent children who had suffered for over a century because of their father's actions had finally been allowed to rest in the loving embrace of eternity, free from the bonds that had held them captive for far too long.